I'm going to see how this works. Amy Stover first asked me to do this over a year ago. And I said, oh, can we put it off until I retire? I'm going to have more time then, but that hasn't really proved to be the case. I am officially still an employee of Prudential for 10 more days.
Turn it
but,
down a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, we'll try that. We can keep adjusting it. I was reminded by Dave's sermon this morning that in some ways my career at Prudential was one of being a translator. I can remember, he reminded me, over 30 years ago, a friend of mine was teaching a church and society class at Drew Theological Center and asked me to meet with a group of those students, and I recall that I spoke about how people framed issues in different ways and spoke different languages, and at the time I suggested that the language of business was efficiency, the language of government was fairness, and the language of the church was justice. So we ended up talking past each other a lot. In a different way, I spent the last 30 years in Prudential in the investment area, the last 20 with a firm called Quantitative Management Associates. We had about 20 PhDs in all the hard sciences that you can think of, and my job there was to translate their ideas for how to analyze stocks and structure portfolios and try to make it comprehensible to pension plans and such. I had a good run, but I don't want to talk today about my business career. I view these Honor Our Own sessions as a chance to tell backstories, and I love hearing the other backstories. Certainly the ones that Firth told, and Ina and Mark Bailey a couple of weeks ago, Bill Lutz. Unfortunately, I missed Paul Nelson's, to my great regret. My story is one, if I may, of tremendous good fortune. It's not one of overcoming great obstacles, it's one of great good fortune. And I can remember my aunt in Altoona, Pennsylvania, when I went to visit her once, reminding me from the Gospel of Luke, to whom much is given, much is expected, and looked me straight in the eye. And I'm sure that's happened to a lot of you. But there is that responsibility, I think, that comes from things falling into place. I put together some slides. I don't know whether you're going to be able to see them. It's easier for me to talk this way. My good fortune started with my parents, if I may. And I'm going to have to lean over each time because the cable's not long enough. One of the things that I like the most is I'm half Australian. My parents, this is their wedding day photo in 1944 in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. My father was from Altoona, just 2 or 3 towns away, I found a couple weeks ago, from where Judy Lutz grew up. My mother from Brisbane in Australia. My father was raised a Lutheran. He decided while he was still a high school student that he was interested in the ministry. He went off to Duke University in North Carolina. Always laughed that he grew smarter every year as Duke's reputation got better and better and better. It wasn't quite so strong when he was there. He did go up to the Yale Divinity School and then became an assistant minister at Central Congregational Church in Providence, Rhode Island, where the senior minister was the Reverend Arthur Bradford, D.D., a member of the Yale Corporation, a trustee of Yale. But the Montclair reference is that Arthur Bradford grew up in Montclair. His father was Amory Bradford, the founding minister of First Congregational Church in Montclair, and probably the most important man in Montclair in the 19th century. In any event, when the war started, my father felt a great need to serve, and he enlisted in the Navy as a chaplain. Well, that's what got him to Australia. Well, that's where he met my mother, who is the one on the right there. in those stylish times. After my parents married, my father was transferred to the Naval Penitentiary in San Pedro, near Long Beach, near Los Angeles, where he was the first full-time chaplain at the Naval Penitentiary there, where there were a couple thousand prisoners who had gotten on the wrong side of naval regulations. It was a fantastic experience, but it also exposed them to Southern California. They moved back to Providence. My mother, who had grown up in subtropical Queensland, could not get used to snow. She never learned how to walk on icy paths. And in 1948, my father became the founding minister of San Marino Congregational Church. Paul, that's why every day when I woke up, I looked out at Mount Wilson. Paul was just telling me about hiking up to the top of Mount Wilson. Ellen LaBarbera grew up a couple towns away in Arcadia. This church was unusual in that it was the church building was set. There was no congregation, there was no minister, but he arrived in 1948 before I was born with $53,000 in debt and no church members, and go to it. It was a remarkable period. 106 people joined 2 weeks after the church reformed, 190 in the first 6 months. It just got off to a great start. This was the original church, that building there. I'm happy to say it's now called Christ Hall. But 12 years later, this other church was built, and this is the interior with this lovely tree of life mural. My father got me in 1973, when I was still in college, to write the 25th anniversary history of the church. And I look back, I think that's pretty remarkable. He got me while I was still in college to write it. But I was amused when I looked at it last night to see that in 1961, they had a perfect attendance record for the church school. And my older brother, Bob, had 7 years of perfect attendance. My middle brother, well, the next older brother, David, had 6 years. I only had 2 years because I often had asthma. But the nursery school classes met in our house for 12 years. So my mother wanted us out of the way as she cleaned house. I always liked books. One of the reasons I really like this photograph is it's a staged family photograph, but I'm over here on the right, and I'm much more interested in the book on my father's lap than in the camera. There's so many different threads that you can follow, so many different themes, and I thought I would follow 2 threads in this conversation. One is the churches that I've attended over the years, and the other is the libraries that I've used and that I've known. We were certainly a house with lots of books around. I tell Gloria that I look back with amazement. My father subscribed to the Sunday New York Times when I was a kid. It arrived in Los Angeles on Thursday. Well, it was a great period when I was in middle school for all the books about the Civil War, and I had great illustrations for the book reports. The other magazines in the house included Christian Century, but also Saturday Review of Literature and the New Yorker. And the New Yorker is probably the one that's continued, certainly in my house. My father was also a charter subscriber to Sports Illustrated. Sports were just as important. He made sure that we got to know the local public library. This is a new building, and I don't recognize it. But I would ride my bicycle down in middle school or elementary school. I read all the sports biographies, landmark books, those histories and biographies. If you're a contemporary, you know that series. There was another library in town that it kind of through osmosis had a remarkable impact on me. Some of you may know the Huntington Library and Art Gallery and Botanical Gardens in San Marino. Every every time we had visitors or family visiting from Australia, we'd go up to the Huntington Library, walk through the gardens, and poke our heads into this. This is the exhibition area for the library. But almost through osmosis, I got the sense that scholarship and doing research and writing was a good thing. And that, without really formulating it, has always been in the back of my mind. If I want to make sense of something, I usually want to write about it. And in many ways, I've written about most of the things I'm talking about today, although not about that. That got me off to college, to Yale, and again, talk about good fortune. I was probably lucky to get in because that was the year that Yale diversified its class geographically and 10% of the kids in my freshman class were from California. And that's how I snuck in that way. It was also the year, the first year of coeducation at Yale. When I left California, and Paul, you made them, California was celebrating the bicentenary of Father Junipero Serra's establishing the first Spanish mission. And I was trying to wrap my head around 1769. And I arrived, and this is Connecticut Hall on the Yale campus, which was built in 1750. And that just seemed wonderful to me, that had been built 19 years before the first encounter in California. I often use that to study and write papers and such. My freshman dorm was this building over here, Bingham Hall. Nathan Hale statue is there, and I chose this photograph because I couldn't find a photograph of the one that I wanted to refer to. Elsewhere, near Harkness Tower in Brantford College, carved in stone on the side of the wall is, "I wish to be useful, Nathan Hale." And if there's any phrase that has characterized my approach to life, it's in that kind of indeterminate way, but it's, "I wish to be useful." This area was not always so bucolic. I was at Yale in an exciting and challenging and even scary time. My first trip to Washington, D.C. was on a bus to go down to protest against the Vietnam War. Although I hived off and went off to see the Jefferson Memorial. Not knowing whether I would ever get there again. My first view of the White House was seeing it ringed by the city buses of Washington, D.C. with barely an inch between them as President Nixon hunkered down, protected from the protesters. The spring of my freshman year was 1970. That was the Cambodia bombings, the first Earth Day, the Black Panther trial, Bobby Seale and others in New Haven. It was the period of the Kent State shootings by the Ohio National Guard, and we had our share of it. The three of that's Allen Ginsberg, the poet, but Jerry Rubin, I remember listening on the college radio to Jerry Rubin. I could not believe what he was saying. It was the most profanity-laced thing I'd ever heard in my life. And I kind of went down to the big Woolsey Hall to see him in person. Abby Hoffman's the other one there in that photo. They were all in New Haven in the spring of 1970. This was just 2 years after the Chicago 8 trials. And here were the National Guardsmen in New Haven. I look at them now as kind of not terribly fit middle-aged folks, but at the time they were ringing the Yale campus. All of the stores around had plywood. In my naivete, I signed up to be a marshal, to try to help guide the protests. forgetting that when the National Guard released tear gas, that you're between the National Guard and the marchers. So that's where, just outside there is where I was tear gassed. And at the same token, though, later that night, first I made the mistake of rubbing my eyes a couple hours later, but I went out that night looking for, it's hard to sleep, I just to find coffee or tea or something, and I remember asking one of the National Guardsmen a couple blocks away if he knew if anything was open, and he said, "No, but if you find something, let me know." And that essential humanity was important. The next morning, the Tell Chapel, which is the Church of Christ in Yale University, was absolutely packed. William Sloane Coffin was the chaplain at that time. You wanted to be there to see how he would make sense of everything that was going on. And actually, Mike, I'm going to tease you because that was the first time I saw somebody reading the New York Times in the pew before a service, until a couple of years ago when I saw Mike reading the New York Times. The other time it was a journalist, but anyway. It was an important service, and for me it was a kind of a representation of how the church can be right in the thick of things when things come together, both comforting people and challenging them at the same time. This is a more recent photograph. Clearly several rows of pews have been taken out. I guess that's a little bit like First Kong. I used to sit just about here. And Dave, I realized as I think back in the various churches I've attended, I kind of positioned myself just a few pews below the pulpit, probably to distract the preacher. But what sermons? William Sloane Coffin was one of the great preachers of the 20th century. A prophetic voice, terrible administrator, but boy could he preach. And that sort of leaning into the microphones, gesturing, really, and he could really turn a phrase. But there were others. There were lots of visiting preachers. I remember Martin, Betty, you may remember Buckner Coe of the Consultation on Church Union. Henry Nouwen was then at the Yale Divinity School. I remember hearing him 3 or 4 times. There could hardly be anyone more different than William Sloane Coffin in giving a sermon. But it was a rich experience. I said I would track libraries too as another theme, and what libraries, if you're all into that sort of thing. The one on the left is not a church, it's the Sterling Memorial Library. This is before the recent renovation. All those card catalog drawers spilling into the nave, and those have all, basically, they're gone now. The building on the right is the interior of the Meineke Rare Book Library. It's a jewel box of a place. Those are the kind of the rare books in the center. Translucent marble. The story was that they thought of making the walls out of onyx, but there wasn't enough onyx in the world, so they used marble instead. The Meineke brothers paid for it, and the joke was that they made their money through S&H green stamps, and that the outside looked like one of those redemption books. I always had a job when I was an undergraduate, working 10 or 15 hours a week, first year in the dining room. Then for my sophomore year, I wanted to keep statistics for the football team, of all things, and may explain Elliot's interest in part in game analysis, but they wouldn't let me take the job because I was on the track team, and I marveled at that. I scored 1 point in my varsity track career, so I was not at risk of being accused of favoring athletes. But I was shunted over instead to the Beinecke Library and ended up cataloging manuscripts, historical manuscripts, literary manuscripts for the Osborne collection, which is a fantastic collection of materials. And I did that for 3 years, and it was life-changing for me. I seem to have a gift on reading old handwriting and making sense of documents, and one of the things that I like doing now, and I'm not even sure my family knows this, but I'm part of the crowdsourcing effort that the Congregational Library in Boston has, and the Jonathan Edwards Project at Yale, to collect, digitize, and transcribe the church records in New England from the 17th and 18th centuries. And they keep sending me more because I can read the 17th century handwriting. And I enjoy doing that in small doses. I'm working on one now related to the church in Middleborough, which is going through a great division, I think, related to the New Light, Old Light controversy of the Great Awakening period. Anyway, I kind of got my first 15 minutes of fame pretty early on. Just about a month or two into this job in the Beinecke Library, I was able to make a connection. I was cataloging the papers of Tybalt Taft, the first Earl of Carlingford. Mostly diplomatic papers, but there was this group of papers that they weren't signed, they were interesting. And I made the connection that they were had actually been written by King Charles II during his exile. And these notes doubled the number of extant letters from the period of Charles's exile, during when Cromwell and the Puritans ran England. And it got a lot of play. The New York Times picked up the story the following spring, and other newspapers too. It was an opportunity to catch some of the excitement of discoveries, of identifying documents that otherwise would have been anonymous and lost basically forever, and it was fun. I leveraged that and some other things to go off to Cambridge to do my graduate work there. This is my first year at Cambridge, these photos. Cambridge offers a research degree, which means I didn't have to take classes. I had 3 years to do my research. Forgetting to show these things, but anyway, later I hand typed this whole thing. I did a dissertation on the control of the press in 17th century England. It got me into all sorts of libraries, which was good. The thing that I actually, if I may, feel good about is that a year or two ago, Cambridge got in touch and said, may we digitize it? And I was absolutely astonished. First knows this. Somebody must have asked for it. And, well, all the good Cambridge dissertations were published as books. I still take some pride that this was among the first 10 or 12 Cambridge history dissertations that were digitized and that thing. So I don't need the physical copy so much. I love the time at Cambridge, and I say that because it comes back to me now when I think I may have more time and less the need to go off to work each day. Unstructured time for me was immensely creative. I loved the reading, I loved the research, I loved the writing. I loved playing a dozen games of squash. I wish I could still do that at the end of the day. I loved going to movies or having long conversations with friends, going to plays in London. Gloria hates me because I can talk about seeing Alec Guinness both in Cambridge and in London a couple times, John Gielgud, Ralph Richardson, all the great actors at that time. And so it holds up to me kind of a model for how I may spend time going forward if I can keep it unstructured, which will be a challenge. For those of you who have visited Cambridge, you know, it's so beautiful. I was there a couple of years ago, and I just was overwhelmed with a sense of good fortune to have had the opportunity there. This is the view of the chapel from across the Cam, the river. Clare College on the left, and the Gibbs building of the white one, the 18th century Gibbs building at King's on the right. This is the interior of the chapel, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. It is a glorious space, surely the most beautiful Gothic space in all of England. Started in 1441, finally finished during the reign of Henry VIII, with that terrific fan vaulting, the medieval windows, and this fantastic choir. And if there was ever any time that I was going to become an Anglican or an Episcopalian, it was while I was there. I remember one December when David Wilcox, later Sir David Wilcox, the choir director, who was approaching, he was resigning, and without any fanfare at all, he just pulled out all the stops. And so on these December evenings, when it was so dark, so early, maybe 10 of us might show up for evensong, more members in the choir than in the congregation. And that was the first time I heard Handel's Zadok the Priest, another of the coronation anthems, and in that wonderful space. So I went to evensong there a lot. But loyal that I am, I walked down the street to Emmanuel, probably was still Emmanuel Congregational Church in those days, now United Reformed. The Congregationalists and Presbyterians, much diminished in England, merged in 1972 to form the United Reformed Church. This is a church that goes back to 1697, the congregation does. And the stained glass windows are of congregational worthies here, Barrow and Greenwood from the first 50 years of that period. My memory of it is a group of very solid, serious people, and as best I can recall, dressed entirely in browns and grays. It really had there was a real seriousness to the place. A little unlike us, I think. Lots of libraries at Cambridge. This is my college library. I used it a little. Mostly I was made some money by being an invigilator in the evenings. Most of my work was done in the university library, which is that ugly brick building on the right. It was wonderful when I could use Christopher Wren's library in Trinity College, Cambridge, if you know it. Beautifully, these carvings at the end of each bay are by Grinling Gibbons, the great early 18th century wood carver. That's Lord Byron on his pedestal at the end there. Poets' Corner at Westminster Cathedral refused it because of his immoral life, so Trinity was glad to take it. Anyway, the desks are in between the bays, so you sit there surrounded by the books in this 17th century library, and I challenge you not to be inspired. After 3 years there, I came back, and for a while, if you were interested in 17th century books, at least later 17th century books, I was your man. I came back and headed the project at Yale to revise the Wing Short Title Catalog of books printed in England 1641 to 1700. And I brought along a volume that I edited, and my heart sinks as I look at it. It was very detailed, in the end for me very tedious work, and I did not really have time for research or writing. And after 3 years, I decided to try to do something completely different. And that was a time when, perennially, but a time when humanities PhDs were having a hard time getting jobs in the universities, and why not try to prep them for a business career. The National Endowment for the Humanities and the Department of Higher Education in New York started a program called Careers in Business, which I was accepted into and spent 7 weeks at NYU. and then was hired at Prudential by